Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Gomez, and I'm the Director of Education for the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation. Prior to this role, I was a history curriculum director for Uncommon Schools, which is a large charter school network in New York, New Jersey, and Massachusetts. My true passion is history education, so I'm really excited to welcome you all to this webinar on teaching the Pequot War. During our time together, we're going to immerse ourselves in 2 out of the 7 lessons that the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation has already provided for Connecticut teachers thus far this school year. We're going to focus on the content of these lessons by closely determining what the most productive struggle or the most challenging historical thinking students will be doing during these lessons is, and how to prepare for this prior to the launch of the lesson when we're in front of students. So this is a webinar. I do want to let you know there are going to be moments of independent practice for you. So when those moments occur, I'm going to let you know to please pause the video. But first, let me get you settled in determining how to get all of your materials in order. At the bottom of the screen here is a link that I can also provide to Connecticut Council for the Social Studies to share with anyone who takes this webinar. This will navigate you to a Google Drive where there are several materials. There will be the copies of the 2 different lessons, both the student-facing materials and the lesson plans themselves. And then there will also be a number of resources provided by the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation that we're going to cover here in the session. And then finally, there is a handout for this session. It's interactive. It allows you to better to navigate what the flow of this session will be. So I want to encourage you, before you move forward, to pause this video, go to the Google Drive at the link here, and download all of the materials. The very first material you're going to need is our interactive handout for today. Go ahead and pause the video, and then hit play when you're ready to go. All right, welcome back. So you're probably taking this webinar because you've either taught the Pequot War before or you haven't and you're interested in doing so. Prior to working at Mashantucket, I taught the Pequot War in my 7th grade history class, not even in Connecticut. I taught it in Newark, New Jersey. It's a pretty big deal in the scope of American history, and many historians consider it to be one of the very first turning points in our collective nation's history. So we're going to launch by doing a reflection. I'd like for you to take about 1 minute to pause the video and answer the following questions in your interactive handout. What resources have you used to teach about the Pequot War in your classroom, if any? And generally, how do you prepare to teach lessons grounded in student discourse? Pause the video and hit play when you're ready to move on. Welcome back. So if you haven't taught the Pequot War before, you might not have thought much about the resources that you'll use to teach it. Don't worry, I got you covered today. And if you have taught it, you probably already have some good resources that I encourage you to continue to use in class and use the ones in today's lesson to supplement. Now, the second question has to do with general great history teaching and grounding lessons in discourse. We'll get to that a little bit more today. In an in-person session, I'd love to hear all of your great ideas about discourse, but for now, just go ahead and keep those in your mind. So before we can dig into the Pequot War as a topic and how to best teach heavily student-centered lessons, especially those grounded in discourse, we first need to understand how the Pequot curriculum is designed. I'm working with my curriculum writers to create approximately 25 to 30 lessons over the course of 2 school years, all of which will be available to Connecticut teachers to fit into their curriculum in whatever way that they see fit. Now, they are aimed at social studies teachers, but I'd like to encourage anyone listening to this webinar to think about, first of all, if you're not a social studies teacher, how could you use these? Or how could you encourage your colleagues who don't teach social studies to use them in other disciplines? These lessons are going to be released, as I said, over the next couple of years, and there are going to be 9 new ones coming out within the next couple of weeks. These lessons are going to fit into 4 cycles, and each of these cycles has 3 stages. We're going to unpack what this means in just a moment. So today, one of the 4 cycles is available to teachers, but it's not cycle 1. That's going to be the earliest period of Pequot history. Instead, today, as we talk about the Pequot War, we're going to focus on cycle 3, which centers on the period of 1614 to 1640. The Pequots felt that this period was really crucial to begin with, not only because it's imperative to understanding so much about Mashantucket today, but also because whether or not anyone likes it, the Pequot War is what is often taught about the Pequot people and Pequot history in American history classes throughout the country. So with that said, the Pequots felt that we might as well get the narrative right from their perspective. The other cycles are going to be released, as I said, those 25 to 30 lessons total over the course of the rest of this school year and next school year. And the next one that I'm focusing on is cycle 4, which is the period directly after the Pequot War. So what do I mean by cycles and stages? I just threw a lot of language at it too. We're going to go ahead and take a look. On page 3 of your interactive handout, you're going to find a document that's also posted to that Google Drive that I gave you the link to at the very beginning. In a moment, you're going to pause the video and take approximately 4 minutes to review that to review that cycle and stages document and take notes on the following questions in your interactive handout. They are, what are the 3 stages of instruction in the Pequot curriculum? How do these 3 stages help to build a layered understanding of Pequot history? And what questions do you have about the 3 stages? Go ahead, pause the video, and take about 4 minutes to complete this. Welcome back, everyone. So now that you've had the opportunity to look at that document, I just want to hit on a couple of really important pieces here. The 3 stages of history curriculum in the Pequot curriculum are as follows. The first is building knowledge. We need to establish that baseline story in order for our students to understand some of the key facts and ideas that we're going to be discussing as we dig deeper. Stage 2 is what I like to call our literacy-based lessons. Those are our inquiry lessons, our close readings, our guided seminars, etc. Those are really important because they allow students to access primary sources and other more challenging secondary sources to begin to construct some meaning on their own. And then finally, stage 3 is how we assess. Whether it's a formal DBQ or it's some other activity, that's what stage 3 is, so that we can ascertain how our students understand both the content and the historical thinking skills in the lessons. One more extremely important note for all of us prior to digging into any of this Pequot War curriculum or any of the other Mashantucket Pequot curriculum that will be released, and also any good history curriculum in general, is the 4 corners method. You're going to find a copy of the 4 corners resource again at the link that I provided at the beginning of this webinar, and it's also posted with the rest of the Pequot curriculum with the state. I'll be doing a full session, I've been doing full sessions for Connecticut Council for the Social Studies on this, so please look out for an upcoming one. But you can join me, on those so that we can dig deeper into this. But I do want to touch on a couple of key pieces here. As we know, as history teachers, sourcing is crucial for historians. When we read primary sources, students need to consider the author's point of view, the historical context, the intended audience, and the author's purpose. I have here that we're going to have a second session today, as I named, that's not going to happen today, but that will happen in the future as I continue to present at Connecticut Council for the Social Studies. On the right is a picture of that document that you'll find available for you on the link provided at the beginning of the webinar. We've all taught many history lessons as social studies teachers, and we all know that good teaching, regardless of content area, requires strong preparation. In order to help us access a lesson on the Pequot War today, we're going to start by identifying how to best internalize a lesson. If you go back to your interactive handout on page 5, you're going to find a lesson internalization 1-pager, and you'll also find that document again at the link provided at the beginning of today's session. I'd like you to please pause the video and take about 3 minutes to skim it and answer the following questions that are up on the screen. Based on this document, what are the 4 steps of the lesson internalization process? And why does lesson internalization matter? Go ahead and pause the video and hit play when you're ready to resume. Welcome back. First question is pretty easy. That's just direct recall. First, we as teachers need to build our knowledge. That means we need to read through all of the lesson materials presented to us. And then if we don't feel like we're fully comfortable with the content, closing our knowledge gaps by doing our own research. From there, we're going to prepare for the discourse. Now that might be interesting to you. Discourse is an important part of all of our classes, but oftentimes it happens at the end. So why would we start with that? Well, we know that discourse is where our students can show off what they know. By preparing for discourse, we're able to prepare for the highest rigor or most productive struggle. We'll also be able to help ourselves picture what our students will need to say and do to answer the most important task in the lesson, or at least to fill out that exit ticket if it's not the most important task. We'll need to activate knowledge. We'll need to think about how we can use a word wall or other resources in our class to prepare for discourse. And then we want to think through, hopefully our students will give these perfect responses in our class, but that doesn't always happen. What do you think that students actually might say, and how might you respond? Finally, we'll think about, in that preparing for discourse, how we can stretch our students and ask them more rigorous questions to help them problematize or sophisticate their thinking. Step 3 is revising the plan. You're not going to just take this curriculum, walk into your class and rewrite off the lesson plan. How are you going to make it work for you and your students? You could focus on the do now, oral drill activating knowledge, cut and adjust the lesson based on your class length, other resources that you want to use to teach this, and then also plan what discourse will look like in your class. Are there going to be everybody writes moments so all students can jot things down before they discuss? Will students be talking to one another through a turn and talk? Will you use cold call, pre-call, etc.? And then plan your habits of discussion, including any habit rollouts or modeling if needed. How do you want students to interact with one another? How are you going to teach them to build? Finally, my very favorite piece of all of this is preparing to monitor, because we know as teachers that the most important work happens when our students are working independently and we're supporting them by circulating throughout the classroom. So on your materials, you're going to want to jot down the exemplar. What will you be looking for as you review your students' work as they're working independently? How are you going to gather data on who has it, who doesn't, what they have, what they don't have? And then it's really important to add timestamps throughout your lesson to make sure that you're covering all of the great material that you want to work through with your students. So again, just to stamp that, build your knowledge, prepare for discourse, revise your plan, and prepare to monitor. That brings us to our first core idea of today's session. When you have the destination, you can set the roadmap. When you have the destination, you can set the roadmap. As a first-year teacher in the South Bronx, I remember being told, if you don't have a plan for your students, they'll have a plan for you. And this doesn't just mean having an activity for them to complete. It includes having a clear, rigorous destination that we as the teachers thoughtfully prepare to navigate them towards. So in our one-pager under step 2, prepare for discourse, we're asked to prep for the most productive struggle of our lesson. Now, this concept comes from Culturally Responsive Teaching and the Brain by Zaretta Hammond. Before we can do this with our Pequot War lesson, we first need to identify what we mean by the most productive struggle. What is it? According to Hammond, the most productive struggle is the point in the lesson where students may struggle the most. In history classes, it's the place where historical thinking is most featured. So it's not necessarily the most difficult content, but it's the most difficult disciplinary thinking that we're asking students to do. It could be a key line, or it could be how texts corroborate one another in a way that unlocks meaning. We know in inquiry lessons that include more than one document, it's sometimes how those documents fit together that the magic really happens when students start thinking about. So by identifying the most productive struggle, we can be clear on what to monitor for as students are working independently. Pacing is so much tighter because it allows us to go deeper and farther with students on the most important parts of the lesson rather than getting caught up on those less important parts. And our feedback directly supports the most challenging and most important aspects of our class. Students don't need to get everything in a lesson. If we know what is the most important do not stop go moment, we can guide students in being successful there. We know that all lessons have objectives, and those are the skills and contents that we want our students to be able to master. But what about a particular lesson unlocks this learning for our kids? By taking the time to identify what it actually is about the lesson that will allow our kids to grapple as historians, we're going to help them grow in their understanding of what we're teaching them and the discipline of history at large. So finding the most productive struggle in a lesson is not always easy. We're going to go ahead and try it out with these Pequot War materials that I'm giving you today. So you have copies of the 2 lesson plans as well as the student-facing materials on the Pequot War in that folder. Here is a shortcut if you want to grab them here right now, but also you could use the link I provided at the beginning of the webinar. I want you to take about 10 minutes, pausing the video, to skim through the 2 lessons on the Pequot War. Review both the lesson plans and the student-facing materials. Then, in your interactive handout, please answer the following questions. What is the most productive struggle in this lesson? Here are some clues to help you hone in on this. What do you think students are most going to struggle with? Where do they most need to think like historians? Where in the documents will students feel most challenged? And what about the documents? What about the way the documents fit together may most challenge the students? Once you figure that out, I want you to consider, what do you believe is the ideal student response to the most productive struggle in this lesson? So once you've identified where that really challenging historical thinking is going to take place, consider, what do students need to say to show mastery? What would your most successful students be able to take away from the lesson? And because this is a 2-day lesson, what does success look like by the end of day 2? Take about 10 minutes to complete this. If you need more time, that's totally fine too. That's the beauty of a webinar. Go ahead and pause me and come back when you are set. All right, welcome back. So once we've identified the most productive struggle, we need to determine how to help our students to get there. One of the best ways to do this is by creating a monitoring key. Now, for any people who use curriculum with regular student-facing materials, this is more straightforward, and it will look a lot like the tool that I'm about to show you. However, I recognize that some of you, particularly at the high school level, might not use student handouts in your classroom, or at least not comprehensive full packets like the one that we're providing from Mashantucket for our Pequot lessons. So I want you to encourage you about what this might look like in your classroom if you don't have those full student handouts. I've seen it done in so many different ways across different classrooms, and this is all really about a personal choice that you're going to make about how to best teach your students. On pages 7 and 8 of your handout, you're going to see a teacher named Miss Marvania's intellectual prep on the Pequot War lesson that you just studied. I want you to pause the video and take about 4 minutes to review it and answer the questions here on the screen. How does this teacher successfully prepare students to grapple with the most productive struggle? And what else do you notice about this teacher's intellectual prep? Go ahead and pause the video and come back when you're set. So you probably had something like this. Mrs. Marvania identified the most productive struggle. She then backwards planned and aligned to the most important parts of this struggle. We call those the do not pass go moments in the lesson. As we know, a lot happens during the course of our history classes, whether they're 40 minutes or they're block scheduling and they're much longer. And not every single activity that we ask students to engage in, not every single question we ask is the most important to get students to that most important part of the lesson. It's up to you to identify what are the do not pass go most important moments. From there, you want to plan how you're going to monitor student work carefully for the following 4 key elements. You're going to choose the most important based on the document's content and the way that it helps students to answer a question, the most important of the 4 corners. You only have to choose 1. Could choose 2. Don't go with all 4. That's too much to look for. Ask, does the student have the sourcing needed to understand the text as a historical document? Not just the author's claim, not just a summary of the text, but that historical disciplinary thinking of author's point of view, historical context, intended audience, or author's purpose. You're also going to monitor for 1 key line in the text that helps to unlock the core meaning of the document. Did the student identify the key line that unlocks meaning? You are going to monitor for that author's claim. Did the student comprehend the text? Because if they didn't do that, can't move forward. And finally, something that we didn't talk about too much when I brought up that 4 corners document for you to use, the significance statement. Significance statement is the place in an inquiry lesson where students are going to consider how that particular document helps them to answer the inquiry question. This will be repeated for each of the documents in any given inquiry lesson so that students can start to see how those texts interact with one another. So for the significance statement, has the student determined how the text helps to answer the prompt? That brings us to our second core idea of our session. Don't take away the struggle, make it productive. Learning is messy. It shouldn't necessarily always be easy. And in history, there rarely is one correct answer or one way of thinking. That is exactly why we want our students to struggle. But struggle without support or intention is scary and even harmful. We don't want to remove the struggle from our lessons, but we do need to make it productive so that despite the challenges of navigating difficult historical content, our young historians feel the success of their growing brains. Therefore, by planning how to help students successfully tackle the most productive struggle through our own intellectual prep as teachers, we set our students up for great success. So we're going to move into some practice right now. We're going to start this process together. In a moment, I'm going to ask you to pause again and take about 6 minutes or longer, given whatever time you have, to begin creating your own monitoring key as if you were preparing to teach this lesson on the Pequot War. Here's the steps that you're going to take. First, what is the exemplar for the most productive struggle? I encourage you not to look right away at the one that's provided in the teacher-facing lesson plan, and instead answer it on the student worksheet like your students would. Where along the way do you need to monitor while students are working independently to get students there? Again, please consider one of the four corners a key annotation in the text, underlining, marginal note, the author's claim at the bottom of the text, and the SIG statement answering the prompt. Then you want to think about your own classrooms. What students do you think that you will most monitor for? Include students who you believe will have an exemplar, students who will be almost there, and then also students who might be further off. Do not just support those students who you believe will need the most help getting started, because you want to make sure that you're gathering data as well, and you're able to orchestrate a really beautiful discourse following that independent work. How are you going to collect that data? There's a variety of ways you can do that. I like to make a little T-chart on my monitoring key and collect the names of students who have the exemplar, who are almost there, and students who might be further off. And then physically write down, what are the short prompts you're going to use to get students on track? When you jot those down, you minimize the number of words you say to your students, which puts that intellectual task on them and also makes it so that you're not giving the answers. It also allows you to get around the class a little bit quicker if you know exactly what you're going to ask students. All right, go ahead and pause the video and come back when you are set. All right, everyone, we are going to pause here for today. I will follow this with future professional developments through Connecticut Council for the Social Studies on how to continue this process, not just on Pequot War content, but on other lessons that are provided by the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation. I hope that today you found this process of identifying the most productive struggle and using the Pequot War lessons to prepare for how to monitor to best support students in investigating this really important topic to be helpful. Before we close, I do want to leave you with a couple of resources that I found to be helpful in creating the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation's curriculum myself. I want to start by naming that I myself am not a tribal member. I started my career as a 7th grade English teacher in the South Bronx. I then moved on to becoming an academic dean, and I oversaw 26 history departments after that, as I became a director of curriculum for a large charter school network. I'm not a member of this tribe. I'm not a member of any tribe. I did do a lot of work using texts like this, however, to make sure that the language that I was using in my classroom and also the text that I was pulling in for student analysis were appropriate. On the left is Eric Foner's Give Me Liberty. In my opinion, it's one of the absolute best ones for teaching the most comprehensive version of US history, especially at the high school level. Nathaniel Philbrook is one of my very favorite New England historians, although he does much more beyond New England. And Mayflower is a really great resource about Indigenous tensions with one another, intertribal tensions, as well as the tensions between the colonizers when they came over, particularly the English. And it's just really deep and it'll give you a really great picture of Eastern Woodlands history post-contact. In Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States, there's also a young adult version of this and the Mayflower, by the way, that you could use with your students directly. Really gives some great tips on what to teach in your classroom, how to ensure that there's not erasure of Indigenous peoples today, because oftentimes we teach about Indigenous peoples as subjects of the past, not today, and so much more. And then also teaching American Indian history with primary sources is a great resource that has been put out by the federal government. I have to make a plug. Please go and visit the reservations themselves. We have 2 federally recognized tribes and 3 state recognized tribes here in the state of Connecticut. And because I am an employee of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, I really want to put a plug in to visit the very beautiful Mashantucket Pequot Museum and Research Center. It's the biggest Indigenous history museum and research center in the entire world. If you haven't been, such a treat, lots of programming for students. So I highly encourage you to visit. There are others, as I said, too, across the state, so please make sure that you research those as well. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope that this introduction to the Pequot War lessons themselves and digging into them was helpful for you. And I hope that you can carry this transferable skill of identifying the most productive struggle in your lessons and apply that to all of your other curriculum. Have a really great day. Thank you.